Briahna, what's on your radar?
Well, you may recall that after South Africa filed its genocide petition before the International Court of Justice at The Hague, State Department spokesperson John Kirby dismissed the petition as meritless, counterproductive, and completely without basis in fact whatsoever. But on Friday, the principal judicial organ of the United Nations begged to differ. A 17-judge panel overwhelmingly found that South Africa's genocide case is in fact, quote, plausible. Israel's motion to dismiss the case was rejected, and Israel was ordered to, among other things, take all measures within its power to prevent and punish the direct and public incitement to commit genocide in relation to members of the Palestinian group in the Gaza Strip. Following this provisional finding that South Africa's allegations are plausible, the case will now move forward toward a substantive assessment of whether Israel has in fact committed genocide. As international law professor Nico Krisch argued, even a finding of a plausible claim is shocking and extraordinary, as no state should even get close to the point at which an allegation of genocide becomes plausible. But despite a clear legal victory for South Africa, the establishment media broadly characterized the outcome as a loss for South Africa, arguing that the ICJ's failure to explicitly call for a ceasefire validates Israel's actions in the Gaza Strip. The New York Times headline read, UN court demands Israel prevent genocide but doesn't call for a ceasefire. The Washington Post similarly announced UN court orders Israel to halt killings in Gaza but did not call for a ceasefire. The Wall Street Journal also published an editorial board op-ed titled "The UN's War on Israel," with a subtitle accusing the ICJ of blood libel for, quote, trashing Israel's self-defense against Hamas. Notably, the ICJ did not validate Israel's essential defense of self-defense in their decision. Now, following the ICJ decision, John Kirby used a similar sleight of hand as the mainstream media, arguing that the ICJ didn't find Israel guilty of committing genocide. Of course, that's only true because that wasn't the issue before the court. This was a preliminary judgment to see if there was enough evidence for the case to proceed past the pleading stage. As Intercept co-founder Jeremy Scahill put it, the U.S. is engaged in an intentional misinformation campaign by stating that the ICJ didn't find Israel guilty of genocide. It's akin to saying that because a defendant isn't convicted at their arraignment, they are not guilty of the crime. But Kirby's attempt to downplay the ICJ's decision didn't stop there. Listen to him respond to a question about whether he's changed his view that the South African petition was, quote, meritless.
Has not found that they are committing genocide.
They are not dismissing the case, and they do believe
they are committing genocide. We have no indication that that's going on, Sabrina. We just have no indication that they are deliberately trying to exterminate the people of Gaza.
Well, the ICJ specifically cited inflammatory statements that were made by Israel's defense minister referring to Gazans as human animals, the president of Israel saying the entire population of Gaza is responsible. Do you not see that as risking incitement?
Comments like that are certainly also counterproductive and unhelpful. No question about that. But we haven't seen indications that the Israeli Defense Forces are getting up out of the rack every day, putting their boots on the floor and saying that their whole effort is to go exterminate the Palestinian people. They're trying to eliminate the threat that Hamas poses.
Now, Kirby went on to say that the right number of civilian deaths is 0. Now, the actual number of deaths, of course, exceeds 26,000, 70% of whom are women and children. As for Kirby's claim that the civilian casualties do not equal genocidal intent, it is in its ICJ decision, the ICJ cited a litany of statements of genocidal intent from the very top of Israeli government. Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordering a, quote, complete siege of Gaza City, explaining that there would be, quote, no electricity, no food, no fuel, and that we are fighting human animals, i.e. collective punishment, which is a war crime. And Israeli President Herzog saying, quote, unequivocally, it's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It is not true, this rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved. It is absolutely not true. Or Minister of Energy and Infrastructure Israel Katz tweeting, all the civilian population in Gaza is ordered to leave immediately. We will win. They will not receive a drop of water or a single battery until they leave the world. Yet instead of engaging with the substance of South Africa's arguments, articulated in its 84-page ICJ petition, or as summarized by the journalist you saw there, Sabrina Siddiqui, in her well-framed question, Kirby continues to ignore Israel's own stated intentions and to declare that Israel's intent is only to eliminate Hamas. Now, of course, even without the numerous eliminationist statements from senior Israeli officials, there's reason to doubt that eliminating Hamas is a goal the U.S. military should get behind. Military experts in both the U.S. and Israel across the ideological spectrum have acknowledged that Hamas simply cannot be defeated militarily, making this conflict a waste of both taxpayer resources and, of course, precious human lives. Former U.S. envoy to the Middle East, Dennis Ross, wrote in a New York Times column in October, arguing that, quote, as Hamas did after conflicts with Israel in 2009, 2012, 2014, and 2021, the group will almost certainly rearm and restore. French President Macron opined last December, quote, the total destruction of Hamas? Does anybody think that's possible? If it's that, the war will last 10 years. Even former head of Israel's National Security Council and retired Major General Yoria Eland admitted, quote, from a professional point of view, I must give credit to the resilience. I cannot see any signs of collapse of the military abilities of Hamas, nor in their political strength to continue to lead Gaza. So what then is the goal of Israel's bombardment and siege of Gaza? And at what point, if any, will the U.S. ever condition its aid to Israel on its adherence to international law? If America's response to the ICJ's decision is any indication, it seems unlikely that aid to Israel will ever be conditional. Following the ICJ decision, American foreign policy has not meaningfully changed. NBC reported yesterday that, quote, after weeks of private administration requests produced fewer results than the White House wants, the source said the U.S. is considering slowing or pausing deliveries in the hope that doing so will prod the Israelis to take action, such as opening humanitarian corridors to provide more aid to Palestinian civilians. But the same reporting acknowledges that, quote, administration officials have also discussed the Israeli government giving the Israeli government more of the weaponry it has requested as an incentive to take some steps that the U.S. has requested. Well, which is it? More or less? As media critics Adam Johnson and Nima Shirazi, among others, have pointed out, as the Gazan death toll has mounted and American public opinion has shifted overwhelmingly in favor of a ceasefire, the Biden administration has been engaged in a media campaign to frame itself as a moderating force on Netanyahu, even as Biden declines to deny Israel the money or weapons without which it could not conduct its siege. Remember, the scale of Israel's bombardment could not happen without American weapons, money, and diplomatic cover. Israel dropped more bombs on Gaza in the first 6 days of the conflict than America dropped on Afghanistan in the first year of our war there. 6,000 bombs. And in the first 6 weeks, Israel used 22,000 U.S. provided bombs, as reported by the Washington Post. Not to mention America's choice to veto a humanitarian ceasefire at the United Nations. America's aid is so essential to Israel's siege that Biden, Antony Blinken, and Lloyd Austin are being sued in federal court for their complicity. Thus, Biden administration platitudes that it respects Palestinian lives and is doing everything in its power to ensure Israel adheres to international law and humanitarian principles fall somewhat flat. And those platitudes are rendered even more empty in the wake of Netanyahu's clear rejection of America's stated goal of ensuring a Palestinian state through a two-state solution. Now, this sharp questioning of VP Kamala Harris by Katie Couric lays it all bare.
Must do more to protect innocent civilians. We've been very clear, humanitarian aid must flow. From day one, I will tell you, one of my areas of priority included, let's think about the day after, because we must stay focused on an eventual two-state solution.
Well, having said that, I want to tell you something which I'm sure you're well aware of, that Bibi Netanyahu, Prime Minister Netanyahu, recently said. He rejected U.S. calls to scale back Israel's military action in the Gaza Strip or to support a Palestinian state after the war. He even said that Israel, quote, must have security control over the entire territory west of the Jordan River, which includes Gaza. So given those positions, how can you possibly come together? How can the U.S. and Israel come together to solve this? And should aid to Israel be conditional?
So I'll start with the principles that we are applying to this discussion, which we've been very clear with the Israeli government about. One, as it relates to the day after, there should be no reoccupation of Gaza. There should be no changing of the territorial boundaries of Gaza.
And here's what happened when Kerik followed up on this specific question of conditioning aid.
So should aid, Madam Vice President, be conditional? If the Prime Minister of Israel is stating this, should that aid not come if there's not that kind of flexibility that you're seeking?
We are right now in a position of negotiating with Congress to follow through on a commitment we made for aid. And we are taking it one day at a time in terms of what is happening in the region and how we are addressing the issue. But that's where we are right now.
So I don't feel like you really answered my question.
I think I did.
Well, but do you think it should be conditional? I know you're carrying out.
That's not our position right now.
Not right now.
Yeah.
Now, you just heard the Vice President of the United States confirm that America will not condition U.S. aid on Israel aligning with U.S. policy goals, including humanitarian goals. But that's not to say there hasn't been a radical change in U.S. aid policy following the ICJ finding. It just has nothing to do with aid to Israel. Instead of cutting aid to Israel as it stands now credibly accused of genocide, the Biden administration has instead cut aid to the UN organization dedicated to providing relief to Palestinian refugees displaced by the establishment of Israel, UNRWA. Over 100 days into the siege of Gaza, but coincidentally, on the exact day of the ICJ decision finding South Africa's genocide claims plausible, Israel accused 12 UNRWA staffers of being involved in the October 7th Hamas attack. As background, UNRWA employs over 30,000 people and is the largest humanitarian actor in Gaza. 2 million of the 2.3 million people living in Gaza reportedly depend on UNRWA to survive. However, immediately following Israel's allegation, the United States, Canada, Australia, Britain, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, Switzerland, and Finland all immediately cut aid to UNRWA. To be clear, these allegations from Israel have not been proven. As of the time that I'm reporting this, we've been told almost nothing about the substance of Israel's allegations against the UNRWA staffers. As CNN put it in their most recent coverage, quote, details remain scant. But even if the allegations were substantiated, that's cause to terminate and or bring charges against the small number of people claimed to be involved. 12 out of 30,000 UNRWA staffers. Not a cut to aid necessary for a humanitarian organization that represents a last bulwark against mass starvation, disease, and death. An organization that was established in 1948 to support the hundreds of thousands of refugees created by the very founding of Israel in the first place. Here's what Craig Mokhiber, who resigned from his position as director of the New York office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights last year because he said the UN was failing in its task of preventing genocide. This is how he described the recent accusations against UNRWA.
Israel always hated UNRWA because UNRWA represents a lifeline that prevents them from destroying civilian life in Gaza. There are thousands of UNRWA employees in Gaza. So it's not impossible that some of them escaped as well. They actually fired these people. The accusations came from Shin Bet and other Israeli intelligence officials based upon interrogation of suspects that they were holding. People who were tortured said these UNRWA people were also participating in October 7th. But I am not going to be convinced till I see an independent investigation. Even if some of them did, that's not an indictment of UNRWA. The United States chose at this moment to cut off funding on the basis of allegations coming from the torture services of Israel. Wait for the investigation. Some people have been fired. Why would you cut off funding if not to assist Israel in its ethnic purge of Gaza?
Now, I want to be clear as a bell about this contrast. Based on mere allegations from Israel, over half of all aid to 2 million refugees undergoing a, quote, plausible genocide campaign, living intermittently without food, power, medical supplies, or gasoline, has been cut. Contrast this to the U.S. response to the unprecedented number of UN officials who have been killed, some alongside their families, by Israeli bombs since October 7th. 152 UNRWA staffers have been killed by the IDF since October 7th. UN schools and refugee camps have been repeatedly bombed by Israel. But despite ample evidence and, of course, dead bodies following Israeli airstrikes, there have been zero cuts to Israel's aid as a consequence. This raises a difficult question. In the wake of the UN court's finding that South Africa's genocide claims are plausible, is the UN being punished? It's easy to see why Israel and its allies might bristle. The ICJ relied on statistics and testimony from international organizations like UNRWA in the course of its decision. Without reporting by UNRWA employees on the ground, much of what's been happening in Gaza would be inscrutable. A former chair of the Israeli Foreign Ministry Workers Committee seemed to acknowledge as much on January 4th of this year when she argued before the Knesset that, quote, it will be impossible to win the war if we do not destroy UNRWA, and this discussion must begin immediately.
האתגר שלנו במלחמה הוא לחסל את האיום ולא להרתיע אותו, ואנחנו יודעים איך לחסל פעילי טרור, קשה לנו יותר עם רעיון. אונר"א זה המקור של רעיון, שאמרה עינת, היא יולדת עוד ועוד טרוריסטים בכל מיני שיטות, ואי אפשר יהיה לנצח את המלחמה אם אנחנו לא נשמיד את אונר"א, וההשמדה הזו חייבת להתחיל מיד. זה לא רלוונטי לדבר על היום שאחרי. ביום שעכשיו אנחנו חייבים לפעול לעקירה של האיומים האלה לחלוטין, או שאנחנו נפספס את חלון ההזדמנויות, כפי שצוין פה כמה וכמה פעמים כבר עשינו.
To be clear, if the allegations are true, there should absolutely be accountability. And the UN agrees. The UN immediately terminated 9 of the 12 accused staff members. 1 was dead, and the identity of the other 2 were being clarified at the time of this reporting. Attorney General Gutierrez promised to hold any UN employee involved in acts of terror accountable, including criminal prosecution, even though most UN staff enjoy broad immunity. But regardless, the mere unvetted accusations against 0.04% of UNRWA staffers has been enough to half the aid Palestinians rely on to survive. UNRWA predicts it will only be able to function as it's been functioning for about a month without additional aid. On January 4th, Noga Arbel, the former chair of the Foreign Ministry Workers Committee, said the quiet part out loud. UNRWA must be destroyed. Here, as at the ICJ, it appears that Israel is damned by its politicians' own express statements of intent. The question is, will it matter at all?
Yes, I'm seeing the reporting, obviously, on UNRWA. Now, it's more, according to the Wall Street Journal, it's not just 12 people. It was 10% of the 12,000 employees, which would be 1,200 staff members.
That is not reporting that I've seen. It was very specifically...
Intelligence, here's in the Wall Street Journal, intelligence estimates shared with the U.S. conclude that around 1,200 of UNRWA's roughly 12,000 employees in Gaza have links to Hamas or Palestinian
If that's new reporting
Jihad.
since last night, that seems like an escalation, probably in response to how incredible it seems that the initial charge that resulted in the, 9 countries withdrawing their aid over the weekend were specifically because of an accusation of 12 officials out of 30,000 that are employed by UNRWA.
I mean, you know what I'm going to say, which is that I wish we would withdraw funding to both Israel, the state of Israel and to UNRWA. I don't think American taxpayers should be on the hook for both destroying and then rebuilding the Middle East. I think it makes no logical sense to be involved to that degree. And I think, if people want to voluntarily give their money to either of those efforts, that's on them. But we should be less involved as a matter of standard practice.
Well,
so I have no problem suspending that funding, but I would also suspend funding to Israel, as I've said.
It's interesting that you bring up that people should voluntarily be able to give to UNRWA if they like, because in fact, in the UK, the banking system has been attempting to block donations, private donations to UNRWA. We've seen something similar here with truckers and some other instances where people are being accused of funding terrorism to want to continue to fund this UAID aid organization. So this is where we are. I think the central contrast that people should really keep front of minds is the alacrity with which the global north, the Western communities, America and its client states moved to withdraw aid from a UN organization because of a mere unsubstantiated accusation from Israel, as Craig Mokhiber pointed out, information that was gotten under duress using torture techniques, and at least in some instances, versus how America has responded to substantiated, proven deaths of UNRWA staffers, which have been unprecedented. The UN has never lost as many staffers in this period of time in one conflict, 152 and counting. And overwhelming documentation of IDF bombs that have repeatedly struck UN refugee centers, UN schools, and the like, which has resulted in these kinds of deaths. And the asymmetry, whatever you think of what's true, it may end up being true that these 12 people, and maybe even more, participated in October 7th. But to say it's okay and we should immediately withdraw aid from a humanitarian group because of those kinds of accusations, but not withdraw aid from Israel when it has been responsible for, now estimates are closing in on 30,000 deaths in Gaza, including the deaths of all of these UN staffers in UN schools and refugee camps. The asymmetry there, I think, is just very difficult to ignore.
Well, let us know what you think. We'll have more Rising right after this.